Hello and welcome, everyone. We're so glad to welcome you to the Positive Link Speaker Series with Adam Galinsky, our speaker today, talking about his new book, Inspire, and the Inspire Advantage, the universal path for leading yourself and others. I'm Monica Warline, Faculty Director of the Center for Positive Organizations, and so glad to be your host for the day. I want to start us off by mentioning a couple of technology notes. We are using Zoom webinar function today, so you won't be able to speak and we can't see or hear you, but we do have the question and answer feature turned on and we will be taking questions. So please grab the Q&A panel and ask whatever you would like to ask Adam, and I will ask as many of your questions as I can in the time that we have. I also want to thank our sponsors for helping us bring positive links to you. We get support from the Tauber Institute for Global Operations, the Sanger Leadership Center, and the Zell Lurie Institute for Entrepreneurship. We have promotional partners who help us get the word out, and we'd like to thank them as well, including Ann Arbor Spark, the Managerial and Organizational Cognition Division of the Academy of Management, and the Organization Development and Change Division of the Academy of Management support us and help get the word out. If you would like to be a promotional partner and help us get the word out, we would love to hear from you. And finally, just a note that the Center for Positive Organizations supports Positive Links and brings it to you as a no-cost way to learn about the important work that so many of our community of scholars are doing. And if you enjoy these events and would like to help us keep them free and available to the public, all support is graciously received. And now I want to introduce someone that I have admired for a really long time as an organizational scholar, one of the most renowned and respected scholars in the field of leadership and organizational behavior. Adam Galinsky is the Paul Colello Professor of Leadership and Ethics at Columbia Business School. He's the author of over 300 scientific articles and chapters. It's very common to find him cited in the media talking about his work. He is a master teacher of ethics, and he has been named in the past as one of the top 50 business school professors. He's an incredible storyteller and writer, and he'll be talking, as I said, about this book today, which I have been fascinated by, which I've turned to again and again as I've been teaching and thinking about topics related to leading ourselves and managing our professional relationships and building a more inspiring world. So, Adam, I want to invite you to turn on your camera, come forward onto the stage, and I want to say a huge thank you from the Center for Positive Organizations and the entire community of positive organizational scholarship, A, for writing this book, and B, for joining us today to talk about it. We're so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here. So excited to talk about the book. I'm actually here from Singapore. I'm on sabbatical this year, so it is 11 o'clock at night for me, but I am wide awake and so excited to be able to share some ideas with you. I want to start off and have you think about the last flight you took. Just think about taking off on this plane, being in the air. And imagine you're on this plane and suddenly you hear an explosion and the whole plane rattles. It's almost as if you've had a midair collision. And then you notice that the explosion has actually caused a hole in the plane, right? And now air is sucking out. A passenger seems to have been stuck in that hole. And suddenly the plane is starting to descend. It's descending over 20,000 feet in less than 5 minutes. And If you're on this plane, like those members of Southwest Airlines 1380, you would probably do what they did, which is frantically get on Wi-Fi and start writing goodbye messages to their family, thinking that these are their last moments on Earth. About as the plane is descending, the pilot, Tammy Jo Schultz, comes on the intercom and sends 10 simple words that have one of the most profound and dramatic effects on people's experience. She says simply this: we are not going down, we are going to Philly. And the passengers talked about how those 10 words churn their panic into possibility. She helped them make sense of their experience, that this descent wasn't plummeting to Earth, but was a planned and orchestrated way of maneuvering in order to get people down. Tammy Jo Schultz expertly landed this plane. When you hear her on the flight control talking to air traffic control, she is about as calm as you can imagine. She delicately lands the plane and she actually parks it right next to a fire truck so that it is on the exploded engine side of the plane in case there's a fire. She actually lowers the flaps of the wings in case one of the passengers panics and jumps out of the wings. And then she gets up and she goes row by row and she looks every passenger in the eye and makes sure that they're okay. Finally, when she gets off the plane, she's met by the EMT and they want to make sure she's okay. And one of them asks her a question that surprises her. He said, "How did you get through security this morning?" She said, "What?" He said, "How did your nerves of steel not set off all the alarms? You're completely calm. Your blood pressure's calm. Your heart rate is normal." And people talked afterwards about her words, her competency, and her empathy as she walked down that aisle. Now, I want to contrast Tammy Jo Scholl's experience with another captain who also dealt with a massive hole in his vessel. And this person is a man named Francesco Schettino, who's captain of the Costa Concordia. Now, the Costa Concordia left on a 7-day cruise in the Mediterranean, going towards Tuscany. And at some point, it got very close to shore. Now, it's debatable about why they got so close to shore. Captain Schettino claims he was saluting mariners on the shore. Prosecutors claim he was trying to impress his mistress, who was on board, a Moldovan dancer. But what isn't in dispute is what happened next is he got too close to the rocks and they tore a 115-foot hole in the side of the ship, which caused it to, as you can see, eventually turn over. Now, what Captain Schettino did next was not call the Coast Guard. He spent a long time, about a half an hour, trying to figure out what story he was going to tell. So the water rushing in caused an electrical blackout, and he was going to try to say that the blackout caused the crash. He tried to pin the responsibility on the helmsman. When he finally called the Coast Guard, it took him a long time of dithering to finally fess up what was happening. It was almost an hour after the crash that the alarm to evacuate came in, but there was even then confusion where some passengers were told to go back to their room. Now, eventually, there's a audio of him talking to the Coast Guard, and he's talking to them from one of the lifeboats. Now, he claims that he accidentally fell into the lifeboat, but what's really even more remarkable is that he somehow also fell out of his captain's uniform into civilian clothing. So he was literally sitting in a lifeboat while his boat was sinking in civilian clothing, hiding. And you can hear the outrage in the Coast Guard's voice when he says, "I'm going to make you pay for this." And he did pay for this. He actually was sentenced to 12 years in prison for manslaughter, dereliction of duty. And I want you to think about the differences between these two people. Now, notice their similarities. They're both captains. They're dealing with a hole in the side of their vessels, but how they responded in this crisis is completely different. Captain Schultz, she helped people make sense of their experience. We're not going down, we're going to Philly. She was courageous and competent and calm in landing the plane, and she showed compassion to each of her passengers. Captain Scatino, he caused the accident, refused to take any responsibility, did not give people the context for how they could help save their lives. 30 people lost their lives, numerous people were injured, and he acted in a way that you could hear the infuriation. And so I want you to think for a second about someone from your own life, a Captain Schultz, someone that inspired you. And I want you to think first about that feeling of inspiration. I call it a wellspring of hope and possibility. And I want you to think about what was it about that person that inspired you? Was it something about the way they were in the world or their words or their behavior? What was that characteristic? Now I want you to think about someone else that changed you inside, a Captain Scatino. But instead of creating that wellspring of hope and possibility, this person creates a seething cauldron of rage and resentment. And I want you to think about what was it about that person that made your blood boil? Now, I've asked this question of tens of thousands of people across the globe, and I want to share a number of what I call big ideas that have come out of this research. And the first big idea is this: inspiring and infuriating leaders exist on an enduring continuum that is made up of three universal factors. So I want to break down this a little bit. So first of all, I want to mention they're on a continuum, right? So Tammy Jo Schultz, Captain Schultz, helped people understand where they were in the world. Captain Scatino didn't. She was courageous, right? He was cowardly, right? She took the perspective of others. He only focused on himself. So there's this enduring continuum. The second thing is I've asked tens of thousands of people across the globe, and these three dimensions are truly, that I'm going to give you, is truly universal. There's not a single inspiring characteristic that is mentioned in one country that's not mentioned in every other country in the world. And then the third is that there are these three universal factors. I call them visionary, how we see the world; exemplar, how we are in the world; and mentor, how we interact in the world. We can inspire people in how we communicate, how we present ourselves, and how we interact with others through our words, through our actions, and through our interactions. And I'm going to give you a mnemonic device to help you remember this. I call this the Venn diagram of inspiring leadership. Now, the second big idea I'm going to give you is that why are these the three universal factors? And visionary, exemplar, and mentor are the three universal factors because each one fulfills a fundamental human need. So being visionary fulfills the fundamental need for meaning and understanding, right? That's what Tammy Jo Schultz did when she said, we're not going down, we're going to Philly. Being exemplar fulfills the fundamental need for protection and passion, right? And we saw Tammy Jo Schultz protect her passengers. And mentor fulfills the fundamental human need for belonging and status. She made her passengers feel recognized and seen. And so I'm going to go through each of these three different factors in detail. So what does it mean to be visionary? Well, I'm going to give you a little scenario from a study done by one of my dissertation committee members, Marcia Johnson, back in 1973. And I want you to see if you can figure out what's going on here. I've given this all over the world, CEOs all over the world. Almost no one can solve this, but I'll read it out to you. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things in different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient, depending how much to do. If you have to go somewhere else to lack facilities, that's the next step. Otherwise, you're all set. But it's important not to overdo things. It's better to do too few than too many. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again, and they can be put into their appropriate places. So I want you to think if you can figure out what's going on here. Well, this is one of the conditions in Marcia Johnson's experiment. In the other condition, she gave them a title. I'm going to give you that title now, and I want you to see how fundamentally transformative it is to read and understand this text when you have the title. And the title is Doing the Laundry, right? We separate the lights and the darks. We might have to go to a laundromat. We don't want to break the machine, right? We put things back in their places. And so giving the title means every sentence takes on meaning. Each sentence connects and coordinates with the others. Everyone reading this has the same shared vision. That's exactly what Tammy Jo Schultz did when she said, we're not going down, we're going to Philly. It gave their experience a sense of meaning and made people understand the actions that were being taken. But there's another part of Marsha Johnson's experiment that makes this even more interesting. It's not just that it's easier to read, it's what happened next. She later gave people a memory test. Now, the people who got the title, they didn't remember this word for word, but they remembered the gist. The people who get the title, some of them couldn't even remember reading anything. They just couldn't simply process it. So part of what visionary means is it gives us an optimistic, meaningful vision of the future that helps us make sense of our experience. Now, effective visionaries not only offer this vision, but they make it easy to follow, understand, and they make it engaging so it captures our attention. Now, the easiest way to make something easy is to make it simple. And I call this the Inception rule after the movie Inception, where Leonardo DiCaprio tries to plant an idea in someone's head during a dream. And he discovers it's not about how deep you go, it's about how simple the idea is. So you want to constantly be thinking, how can we make this more simple? Another way that we can make things easy to understand is by answering this question. What does almost every song in the world have? It has a chorus, a refrain. The fact that almost every song across the world has the same element tells us something fundamental about the human mind. The human mind craves, right, that constant theme that's repeated again and again and again. So to make it easy, we want to make it simple and we want to repeat it. Now, I'll give you an example of how powerful this is and how it helps make sense of people's. We're literally on Zoom right now. Well, in March of 2020, the world discovered Zoom, and Zoom also discovered the world. Now, their tagline or their mission or their vision is delivering happiness. And that seems nice and cuddly and good, but there's another element to it. That vision helped them make incredible high stakes decisions easily and efficiently. I'll give you two examples. One is what should be the customary or baseline functionality of Zoom? Well, if there's too many features, people get overwhelmed. That does not deliver happiness. If there's too few features, then people can't do what they want, and that doesn't deliver happiness. So they really worked on finding the Goldilocks baseline of features. Second thing, probably the greatest destroyer of happiness any of us have ever known are hour-long wait lines and customer service. So they knew that a key for their customers' happiness was being able to get questions they had answered quickly as possible. So they hired tons of people who could help them, some of them who were looking for work because COVID had put them out of work. So a great vision allows people to make decisions easily, quickly, and effectively. Now, how do we make it engaging? Well, we can use visual language. So Drew Carton, a professor at Wharton, did this great study where he just changed whether he told that our mission is to make our customers satisfied or our mission is to make our customers smile. And then he had people create a product. And he found that when they got the one that had more visual language, they actually created better, more engaging products for people to use. So we can imagine that. Here's a study that I recently have done. I haven't published it yet, but we analyzed over a century of US presidential convention speeches and a century of United Kingdom party manifestos comprising over 1.2 million words. Notice the convention are given orally, the manifestos are written, and we controlled for economic factors like GDP, inflation, employment, political factors like incumbency, even popularity, right? Pre-convention polling. And we coded these for the amount of visual and metaphorical language, and we found that the eventual users used twice as much visual language and metaphors than eventual losers. And one of my favorite examples is this, I still remember this from the 2000 convention. This is how George W. Bush ended his Republican nomination speech by saying that Americans live on the sunrise side of the mountain. So we want a meaningful and optimistic vision that is easy and engaging, and we can do that by making it simple, visual, and frequently repeating it. And then in doing so, we help people make sense of their experiences. Now, one question is, how can we become more visionary? And one of the things that my research and many of the research shows is we can have people reflect on their values. So here's one study. So this is an example at Columbia Business School. We have everyone write down their five most important values in a hierarchy, and we give them a card. Here are my five values. But here's a study that we did. We worked with the Swiss Employment Agency, and one of the worst things that can happen to people in their lives is when they get unemployed. It is one of the five biggest stressors. And so we worked with the Swiss Employment Agency, and people came in to register for benefits. Half of the people were asked to reflect on their values, why they mattered to them, how they demonstrated them. And 2 months later, we had to end the experiment because the effect was so profound. Twice as many people had a job 2 months later, and the employment agency asked us to give everybody the values affirmation. So we can become more visionary by reflecting on our values. Now I want to talk about being a great exemplar. And the first thing you want to do to be a great exemplar is consistency. Inspiring leaders embody their vision. They're not hypocrites. As the former CEO of PepsiCo said, don't ask someone to do something that you wouldn't do yourself, right? So that's one of the most important things. The second thing, I'm going to show you two pictures. They're very similar. I saw one of them on the island of Spetses off of Greece. This is Bouboulina. She led the Greek independence. This is George Washington. Notice that their boat is the lead boat. They're standing up in the boat. They're taking on the most risk. And so inspiring leaders are calm and courageous protectors, exactly like Tammy Jo Schultz. One of the things that I ask people to do all over the world is I ask them, tell me about a passion of theirs. And if I asked you to do that right now, you would listen to someone's passion and you would notice that passion transforms people. You would notice that their eyes light up. You would notice that they smile, a big beaming smile, that they're going to speak really quickly, that they're going to use their hands, they're going to lean in as if telling you a secret. When we are passionate about something, it's in our eyes, it's in our mouth, it's in our throat, it's in our hands, it's in our body. And then I would probably ask you, well, what happened to you when you listen to that passion? And people say, my eyes sparkled. I started to smile. I could feel that energy inside of me. Now, there's another thing that's related to being a great exemplar is authenticity, and it's perfectly matched with passion. Imagine if you tried to fake passion. You'd have to light up your eyes. You try to smile. So authentic passion is inspiring. And I've shown this in my research. I've shown that in Dragon's Den, which is a variant of Shark Tank, that one standard increase in expressing passion in the way I just said, in your eyes, in your mouth, in your hands, leads to a dramatic increase in receiving funding. Now, this authentic passion means something really important. You can inspire others if you aren't inspired. So how do we become a better exemplar? Well, we can think about our most powerful, best moments. That's what one of my former students, Jillian Koo, did, who's now tenured and actually professor at LBS, London Business School. She's the vice dean there now. But before she did her LBS job talk, she wrote a little essay about time that she felt her powerful, most in control, her best self. And she said, in that moment, I could feel the confidence in my veins. I felt super, and I went out and was super. So we've actually tested this in lots of different studies. Hundreds of studies around the world have used this technique that my colleagues Deb Grunfeld, Joan McGee, and I created. And we've even shown this in jobs, that people are more likely to be selected for jobs if they've engaged in this high power reflection. We become better exemplars, more authentic, more passionate, more courageous, more calm when we reflect on our most powerful moments when we were our best selves. And the third and final one is being a great mentor. And great mentors, I'm going to give you a little physics problem to understand this one. When you put force and pressure on an object, what direction does it go? Well, it goes in the direction of the force. That's Newton's first law of physics. We're going to change this from a physics problem to a people problem. What happens when you put force and pressure on a person? What direction does he or she go? Well, they tend to push back. So if you don't remember anything today, I want you to remember these three words. People aren't objects. If people are objects, leadership would be a physics problem, but it's not. It's a people problem. So I'm going to give you a quote now from Confucius that really captures the idea that people aren't objects. Tell me, and I will forget. Show me, and I may remember, but it's only when you involve me that I truly understand. And there's three of these mentor inspiring versus infuriating distinctions that are really important. The first is inspiring peer leaders empower others everywhere across the globe. I've talked about this in Hong Kong, in Thailand, in Singapore. It still comes up everywhere that there's nothing more infuriating than when a boss micromanages you rather than involves you or trusts you. The second thing is inspiring leaders elevate others. They share credit rather than steal credit. When you ask people around the world, one of their most infuriating things at work, it's having people steal credit. So sharing credit becomes really important. And then finally, inspiring leaders empathize with others. They do what Tammy Jo Schultz did and made sure each of their passengers were okay versus only looking at themselves like Captain Scatino. So how can we become a better mentor? We can reflect on the perspectives of others. So here's a study that we did with every medical student in the DC area at George Washington and American and Howard. They all did what's called a standardized test, a patient test, where they get exposed to some patients and they have to diagnose what's wrong with them. But for half of these individuals, we asked them, these medical students, we asked them to reflect on the perspectives of their patients that day. And we asked them to think about a recent time where they'd done that. And then afterwards, the patients didn't know about the experiment, but we asked them, how satisfied were you? And they were much more satisfied, they were more trusting, and they were more likely to follow the advice of the doctor who had been given this perspective-taking intervention. So I've given you today the Venn diagram of inspiring leadership. And I want to give you a real world example that really captures this. I was working with a company in 2009 when they were dealing with plunging revenues in the face of the global financial crisis. And I was on a call across multiple continents with every employee when the CEO presented. And I still remember now, 17 years later, exactly what the CEO did that day. The first thing he did is he mentioned the values of the company and the vision. He said, because our core value is empowering employees, I've searched for solutions to avoid more layoffs. Then he calmly explained the proposed solution, and he also mentioned that he was going to take the greatest sacrifice. And then he patiently answered questions for 90 minutes. And his solution was that they were going to do a temporary 3-month pay cut, but senior people would be taking much larger pay cuts than junior people and people who made less money. But he was also going to give them something. He was going to close offices at noon on Fridays since there was less summer work and people could have longer weekends. And so this is an example, again, of a crisis where leaning into being visionary, helping people make sense of the world, tapping to values, being that calm protector, and then being that mentor. Now, I'm going to give you a couple more big ideas. The third big idea is this. Inspiring leaders aren't just born, they're also made. I have shown you that there is a universal set of attributes and behaviors. They can be practiced, they can be nurtured, and they can be developed. Now, these are the ones I gave you. The fourth big idea is this. When you're a leader, you don't have the option of not having an impact. Neutrality is not on the table. Your behavior is going to inspire or infuriate. And I'm going to tell you a story about 1993, September of 1993, my first day as a doctoral student at Princeton University. I was taking a class, 3-hour seminar with Danny Kahneman, who would one day become the only psychologist to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And I was looking for a moment. There's 10 other graduate students. There's 11 of us in the room. I wanted to prove that I belonged. And I raised my hand to say something. And I still remember what Danny did that day. It's the opposite of the person talking with passion. He scrunched up his face, closed his eyes, didn't frown, crossed his arms, shook his head, and said, "That's not right at all." And when he said that, I froze in space. Those words reverberated inside of me. I was humiliated. It took me weeks before I could speak in any class, let alone Danny's class. But about 6 weeks into the semester, I was walking down the hallway and Danny passed me. Without breaking a stride, over his shoulder, he said, Adam, I love reading your reflection papers. You're a great writer. And then he turned the corner. And I literally was so infused with energy, I skipped down the hallway. I didn't know what to do. And these two very different Danny Kahneman statements actually represent the exact same phenomenon, something that I have labeled the leader amplification effect. When you're a leader, everything you say and do gets amplified, right? Your criticisms become humiliating criticisms, but your compliments become glorious praise. Here's another example that someone told me. She saw her boss on a Thursday, and the boss said, Hey, come by my office at 3 p.m. I need to talk to you. Or come by my office Tuesday at 3 p.m. I need to talk to you. She didn't sleep Thursday night. She didn't sleep Friday night. She barely slept Saturday night. Sunday, she was a walking zombie. She finally gets to Tuesday, 3 p.m., and he says, I just want to go over the agenda for Friday's meeting, right? And so those words, I need to talk to you, and they come from a leader. They're scary, right? But it also tells us something really important. If we can take the perspective of the person that we're talking to and recognize the impact we have, we can solve this problem. Imagine if he just said, come by my office Tuesday, 3 p.m. We can go over Friday's agenda. It's literally the same number of words, right? But it requires understanding the leader amplification effect and how it impacts people. Here's my last big idea. Reap what you sow. Now, this comes from the Bible, right? The idea that that which we put into the world, we get back in kind. Now, my REAP is a homonym. It's an acronym, and the first R stands for reflection. Now, I've already shown you that reflecting on our own experiences are the seeds of inspiring others. Reflecting on our values makes us more visionary. Reflecting on our powerful, most best experiences make us a better exemplar. Reflecting on other people's perspectives makes us a better mentor. But what I want each of you to do is once a month is reflect on your own inspiring and infuriating experiences and try to understand why they occurred and how you could go on the inspiring and the continue more often. Second, I want you to also reflect on the inspiring others in your life. I want you to think, how could I emulate them? That's the E of REAP. And then the I is, how can I turn those reflections into intentions? And finally, how can I turn those intentions into practice? If you can reflect, emulate, attend, and practice, you can become a more inspiring person on a day-to-day basis. And I'm going to end with one final story, and then I can't wait to hear your questions and answer them, is a man named Joseph Stigliano. Joseph Stigliano was president of a bank. He has 1,200 employees, and he sends a birthday greeting to every single person. When I met Joseph and he told me the story, I said, that's impossible. He said, no, it's not. He said, I do it in 10 to 15 minutes over coffee every day. Now, obviously, he has to be prepared with a spreadsheet, but he knows whose birthday it is, and he sends them a one-line note. And he showed me an example. It said, hey, Monica, happy birthday. I hope you have a great weekend. How was bowling? And then he shows me the response. And the response is like, oh my God, bowling was so amazing. I did this, blah, 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 blah. And so I shared that with the CEO of a company. And then a month later, he called me back and he said, I actually followed what Joseph did. What I did is every morning over coffee, I just reached out to one person in my organization. I either expressed gratitude or I expressed praise to them. And he said, I did that to put a skip in their step. But by texting them this message, they sent me these glowing comments back and they put a skip in my step. And so that's what I call on all of you to do, is to think of ways that you can put a skip in other people's step. And if you do that, they're going to put a skip in yours. Thank you so much.
I think the round of applause is breaking out. We just can't hear it. Adam, thank you
Oh,
so much. Um, you have so many wonderful stories, so keep the stories coming. I I want to ask you a question, selfishly ask you a question that I'm curious about, and then I'm going to turn to the questions that are
sure.
populating. And the Q&A panel. And if you all have a question you'd like to ask Adam, please open up the Q&A and start putting them in there. So in one of the, well, throughout the book, but in several places in one particular chapter, you talk about leaders as architects.
Hmm.
And I love that metaphor. I've used that metaphor too. And I know that today, as you're sort of inspiring us and coaching us how we all can act as more inspiring leaders and use these ideas. Um, but if you think of leaders as architects, you're thinking of them not just as using, right, their own modeling, but also shaping social structures, right? And
Yep.
shaping policies and practices and guidelines and procedures. I wonder if you could just connect the dots, right? Like you talk about all these individual things we can do, and then how can we also be better architects in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Two things I'll say about that. The first is, at one point I almost thought about when I first had the idea for the book, it was called Actors and Architects. And the idea being that, as leaders, we're on stage, kind of like an actor, and that's where the leader amplification effect comes from. But we're also architects, we're designing policies and practice that are influencing people even when we're not present, right? And so I think it's a really useful metaphor because sometimes we can think about how can we change a dynamic? And I'll give you one of my favorite examples of this from my own professional life. So when I was at Northwestern, we used to have such vicious faculty meetings over hiring, and everyone was trying to manipulate the rules and change the voting procedures so that their preferred candidate would win. And I always joke that the only time I felt homicidal in my professional career was during these meetings. And Keith Mernon, one of my colleagues, this incredible decision-making researcher, suggested that we meet one summer. And he said, let's just go over and come up with all of our voting system and rules when we have no candidates on the table. Right. So this was kind of like the veil of ignorance.
Mm.
And so it took us about 8 hours. And we had it and we brought out each meeting. And what I always tell people is I went from feeling like furious anger towards people when I didn't get my way to feeling disappointed. Right. And so it just fundamentally transformed the dynamic because we took the conflict out by having a system in place. I mean, it's why we talk about having the rule of law in the United States. But sometimes it's even more simple than that. So I'll give just one other sort of simple example, which I really like, is that when I have now an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, but when I first took them to school when they were in kindergarten and first grade, my kindergartner was on the second floor and my first grader was on the third floor. So I dropped my kindergartner off, but he wanted to have a long goodbye and he wanted to hug and jump me and blah, blah, blah. And my first grader, who, like a firstborn, is very type A, and he just wanted to get to his classroom, would get so upset. And then I would get to sit hit him and I would be like, be patient. And so there's all this conflict. And then one day I was walking to school and I just said to them, I said, I have an idea. Why don't we just switch the order? Why don't I drop Asher off on the third floor and then we'll walk down to the second floor? And then it just solved everything. Asher got to his classroom on time. He was very happy. And then Aid could take as much time with me as we wanted. And so when we start thinking about like an architect, what I like to say is we just take it away from a person problem. What's wrong with this person? And we start to think about instead of my getting mad and being so angry at Ash for not being patient, could I change it? And when I wrote this book, I had a writing coach, this amazing person. I think she might be on the call. Rena Seltzer is just one of the most wonderful people in the world. But she told me a story about, a kid who had behavioral problems at school. And part of the problem, they switched to new schools and suddenly he didn't have behavioral problems. And it was because recess was earlier in the day. He just had to get energy out. So we start thinking instead of blaming the child for having these behavioral problems, are there ways that we can solve this that don't blame people, right? By having recess early in the day, putting the impatient person to school first, right? And so thinking like an architect just helps us think about how do we redesign the world. I'll give you just one final quick example, which is that I had a student, a PhD student, who's very smart. He just could not articulate himself with me, and he stammered. And I realized, he's sitting in this chair here, and I'm in this taller chair, and we just switched chairs. And then I always joke he became like the Muhammad Ali of ideas, like there's just something about when I was above him, it just put him in this
Mhm.
position. If we just reversed it, he suddenly could find his voice. So that's what I mean by thinking like an architect. How do we just redesign the world in a way that solves the problem rather than blaming people?
Yeah. Thank you for that. I will keep using that metaphor and being inspired by your stories. There's a question from Mary in our question and answer panel about the how to work with the infuriating leaders in our lives. So Mary tells a little story in the Q&A about um, interviewing for an internal position where it came to light that one of her colleagues had taken her ideas and used them without giving credit. And so she's wondering how to continue to be generous with ideas and with good work, but not be taken advantage of.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of things that I'll say about that. The first thing is that uh, I always tell people like you have to be a strategic thinker, right? So you have to like some people you can trust and some people you can't, right? And I think that's a really important, situation. I remember I gave a talk at a university in Europe, at the University of Cologne, and the students were sharing their ideas over lunch. And they're like, "Oh, that was such an amazing lunch that we got to share ideas." And I was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Well, our professor, he knows certain people steal ideas, and so he doesn't let us share ideas when that person comes, right? So you have to figure out who you can share the ideas to. But one of the things that I've done other research that's not really in the book, but I had a TED talk on like how to speak up for yourself, and I've asked people another question all over the world, which is when did you feel comfortable speaking up or showing more courage, for example, or when did you feel uncomfortable speaking up or feel forced down the direction of moral cowardice. And one of the most important things that comes up is the idea of having allies or social support. And so one of the things to do, with an idea is to make sure that, that other people that you really trust can back up that that's your idea, right? And so you can make sure that the idea gets put into place. I think, sometimes we have to sit in our infuriation. There's not much we can do because a person's powerful. And if we contest them, they have the power to hurt us. And so we have to think about ways to get around that. I will say one thing about infuriating leaders, and I think people have learned this about some of our politicians in the world, is that people become particularly infuriating when they feel insecure, right? When they
Mm-hmm.
don't feel that they have the status that they need or the standing that they want. And so one of the ways that for some people to put them on the more inspiring side, we have to butter them up, right? We have to make them feel more secure and good about themselves. And so, I think that's another way to think about that. And the final thing I'll say is we have a duty as organizations to help train people to be less infuriating or to get rid of those people who are truly infuriating.
Can you expand on that last comment a little bit? There are some questions in here about how to train people about this and how to help people understand and use these ideas in a more systematic way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one of the foundational parts of the leader amplification effect is the idea of self-awareness, that you have to be aware, right, of you as a person interacting and impacting other people. And one of the stories that I tell in the book is that I was a vice dean for 3 years at Columbia Business School, and I became vice dean on July 1st, and I taught in the MBA classroom in August, and I was the first professor that any MBA student saw, and something didn't work that day in the classroom. And I was like, you can imagine how I felt. Like, this is the first day of school. How do we already have something wrong? Like, why was this not set up in advance? And I kind of got very annoyed at one of the people. And like 3 weeks later, my dean came by my office and said, hey, I just want to let you remember that you're always wearing your vice dean hat, even when you're teaching. And I was like, duh. And he said, really? Duh? Like, do you remember the first day you taught? And I was like, yeah. He's like, that person who came and tried to fix your problem, you made her cry. Like, you were
Mhm.
not just, a teacher. Now you're a vice dean yelling at her. And that was like a very, eye-opening experience for me. It was particularly eye-opening because literally that day I was teaching about the leader amplification effect. I think one of the really important things is self-awareness, is that
Mhm.
helping people understand the impact. There's some narcissists out there and there's bad people out there, but there's a lot of people that do things and they have no idea of the negative impact it has on others. And so I think that one of the things is helping people recognize when they're having a positive impact and rewarding that, and then also helping them understand how they might not even be aware of the negative impact they're having.
And a little bit of self-compassion when we mess up, right at the
Yeah,
beginning,
I
a bit
mean,
of
none of us
bleep.
are perfect, right? And I think that's
Right.
right.
So we have in the audience Sherry Alexander. She's a fellow professor here at Ross, also with a very distinguished corporate career, and she's very complimentary of your talk. And she has a couple of questions that she teaches our students in a class on global competency and supervises them as they go traveling all around the world. And so she's asking if you could link your work on the edge effect, which I know has to do with global competencies and creativity, to how what you write about in Inspire. Maybe you could tell people what the edge effect is, and then like if you could connect the dots for Sherry and her,
So wait, I need a reminder. What is the edge effect again?
that people from different cultures and backgrounds, right, exhibit higher creativity and enhanced
Oh
problem
yeah,
solving.
yeah.
So
So
this is
one thing I've studied for 20 years is I've shown in my research that people with multicultural experiences, especially living abroad, have higher levels of creativity. But one of the things that my research has shown is it's not just the experience of living abroad, it's also the psychological orientation when we're living abroad. And so one of the ways that you can think
mm,
about, like, you can think about, the famous, people that, lived in Paris and interacted with, all the different cultures versus someone who, the expatriates who just stuck to themselves, right? And didn't learn, or people who just go deep and, become a resident of the other culture. And the people that tend to become the most creative are the ones that like kind of connect with both cultures, right? Both their home culture and their host culture. And so there's this idea of
mm,
finding this balance, and one of the reasons why it leads to greater creativity is because it forces you to really integrate. And I'll tell you one of the coolest studies that we ever did. This is not something we were looking for, and we discovered it, but we did a study at NCEAD where we measured people's creativity at time when they got to NCEAD and their creativity when they left, and we looked to see like what were some of the predictors. And one of the strongest predictor, well, there's two, important predictors. One was just like what you might call their multicultural engagement. But another one, which is really interesting, was if they dated someone from another country. And so, the idea of that deep experience of really getting to understand another person, and friendships didn't matter as much in the same way that traveling doesn't matter as much as living abroad. But it's not really about dating because we also analyzed J1 visa holders who went back to their home countries, and we found that the stronger the connections they made in America predicted whether they became entrepreneurs when they went back to to their home countries. And so the idea of really getting sort of to understand another culture, but also that comparison between your culture and their culture, and understanding the universalities, but also why things are so like different. Why is customer service different in Britain versus the US? And what does that mean? Really is a key indicator of creativity. Now, another project that I did, I'll just say really quickly, which I think is also equally important, is we analyzed every year of the Premier League. So that, the number one soccer league in the world. And we found that uh, when a manager had more experiences working in other countries, their teams did better. Right there, and it was about for every country they worked in, they had about a 3 point increase in performance, which uh, you know Arsenal beat Man City a couple of years ago by 2 points, right? So right there you could see how that. But this is the coolest thing that we found in our research, which is that they were particularly helpful the more national diversity there was on the team. So when there's a lot of national diversity, they really needed a leader who had a wider cross-cultural perspective, and understood, that when a Japanese person shows up 10 minutes early, they think they're late, and the Argentinian shows up 20 minutes late thinks they're early, right? And so how they are able to handle that.
Well, you talk, I know, in the book about like explicitly about inspiring diversity. And when you connect the dots across all of this incredible work that you've done and you bring it back to inspire, what do you mean by inspire diversity?
Well, part of it is about the designs that one of the things that we can do is we can inspire diversity by creating fairer systems, right? So that's one of I think, the most important things that we can do is we can create more equal opportunities for people. But I think the other thing is really about how we make people feel included. And I think that's a really important characteristic. One thing that we found in our research is that companies that really value authenticity, they can have a more positive impact on increasing diversity, because when people are expressing themselves, it makes other people feel comfortable expressing themselves, even if they come from an underrepresented group. And here's the one thing I'll say, I think is one of the most interesting insights from a lot of different research is that um, uh, practices that create inclusion have to be themselves inclusive. And what I mean by that is that research shows that a lot of practices that are targeted towards underrepresented groups don't always have the positive impact. So it was one thing that Frank Dobbin and some of his research showed, that when we create mentoring systems, let's say for women to be mentored, right? It's not as powerful than if we just create really robust mentoring systems for the whole organization that are constructed in a fair way. And so that's, one example. In the same way, is that how do we create these practices in the same way, the authenticity culture? It's not saying that we're gearing it towards Black employees or women, but it's that want everyone to feel comfortable bringing their full self to work. And so if I see someone being really comfortable with your veganism, then if I come from an underrepresented group, it makes me feel maybe more comfortable presenting my own, cultural interest. And so it's sort of one of the ways we inspire diversity is through being what I call truly inclusive, in those processes. And I think that really makes a difference, and it doesn't create any type of asymmetric resentments that can occur.
This is why I really encourage you, if you're listening, to be inspired by this talk to go get the book and read it, because there's so much. But I mean, what you talked about today is so powerful, and there's so much more packed into each of the chapters that you focus on. I wonder if you could turn to your negotiation work for a minute. Like one thing that I was really intrigued by was how you talk about um, inspire and negotiation and sort of the coaching of people to help everybody walk away inspired by the negotiation because of what it does to like the follow-on effects.
Yeah. I mean, one of the most important things about negotiations, right, that we want to do is the reason why we negotiate is we're hopefully making both people better off, right, in the process. And so, thinking also about one of the things I've shown in my research and negotiations is again finding that right balance between self and other interest is that if we just walk into negotiation feeling compassion and empathy, we walk out worse off because we just give to the other side. But perspective taking allows us to keep our own interest in mind and the others. But I'm just going to share with everyone one of the techniques that I study this for 20 years, and it's one of the most powerful techniques that you can use in any negotiation to get a better outcome, especially when there's like more than one issue on the table, is you actually, and what I've shown in my research, and this is really important, is that if you use this technique, you can be extra ambitious. So you can really push the envelope. It works for men and women equally. And it also works even when you don't have necessarily strong alternatives or a lot of negotiating power. It works for both high power and low power negotiators, but it's simply offering people a choice among two first offers, right? And so we actually have a term for it called multiple equivalent simultaneous offers. They're equal to me. So a car salesperson says, "I'll sell you this car for $25,000 in a 5-year warranty, or $24,000 in a 3-year warranty." Each year warranty is worth for them $500. Right. But so we show in our research is that when you present a choice, people really feel like that you have their best interest at heart. They trust you more, they cooperate, and you expand the pie. And the good news is you get almost all of that expanded pie. So the other side rarely walks away worse off when you do this, but you almost always walk away better off. And so it's a way that people can be ambitious. And so that's an example of inspiring a negotiation is by just offering choice.
I think this is a good transition point to one more question in the audience Q&A panel that I think is a really important one. The person says that this sounds inspiring, but also exhausting. And can you still be an effective leader if you're not being inspiring all the time? And I don't think that's what you mean. So why don't you like speak to that question?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I'm going to say three things about that I think are really important. Some things don't take a lot of time. So I'm going to go back to Joseph Stigliano. He does this 10 minutes over coffee every day. The CEO does it 5 minutes over coffee every day. So we can do actions that don't take a lot of time. But that relates to a second point, which is when we practice things, they become habitual, more efficient, right? And therefore less exhausting. And the third thing I'll say is this is where being an architect also really matters. And so I'll just give you just one of the most simple examples of this. When I became chair in 2014, and I suddenly became chair because the previous chair had passed away, unfortunately. Someone came up to me 2 months into being chair and said that I had done more to change the department in 2 to 3 months than anyone in the last 20 years. And literally, do you want to know the only thing I did? I sent an agenda before each meeting. And then I'd ask the admin director to come to each meeting, take notes. And then it took me about an hour, but I would take her notes and I would say, here's the 5 things we discussed. Here's the 3 things that we resolved. Here's the 2 unresolved issues. And here's the 3 next steps. And that's an example of being visionary. Like I'm helping people make sense of their experience. So they walk into the meeting, know what we're going to talk about. And the second thing is they walk out of the meeting or later being able to come back to that, right? And so that took me an hour. I wouldn't call it exhausting, but I think it saves so much time for me to do that, and but also for other people in the process. And so what I would say to everyone out there is 3 things. The first thing is what are the high leverage, low cost things that you can do, right? And maybe sometimes it's because you're just you're not doing the agenda. Like that's the simplest thing, but it's a really, important one that really powers that. The second thing is what practices can you put into place so that inspiring becomes easier, right? Having the admin come take notes, that was the crucial step, right, in that case. And the third thing is, you know, don't be so hard on yourself. Like that's what, Monica said it best, like we're going to make mistakes. And, one of the things I've shown in my research is shame is a terrible emotion. It makes people put their head in the sand,
Mhm.
right? So don't feel shame, feel guilt, right? And say how you're going to do it better the next time.
And I think in the spirit of mentoring versus involving others versus micromanaging, right? If it's feeling
Yeah.
exhausting to you, involve someone else, right?
Yeah.
And
I think that's
then
a great idea.
you're using inspire, but right,
Yeah.
you're using your model of inspire, but you're also sharing the effort and sharing the labor on the things that feel exhausting. So
Yeah, and let me just, I want to share one other final thing. This is
yeah.
research I didn't do, but Ariella Crystal did. They did this study with a company in Great Britain, and they either the prompt was either they asked fellow employees to give them feedback, or they asked fellow employees to give them advice, and then just looked at the content of what people
Mm,
received. And when you ask for advice, you got really great actionable ideas, and you got
mm,
feedback,
mhm,
you got criticisms, and
mhm,
so
mhm.
one of the things that you can do is by asking people for advice, you make them partners in solving something rather than criticizers, right?
Mm,
And so another thing to do is like, how can you give people advice and not feedback? Is another way to be
yeah.
inspiring.
Yeah, what a beautiful, simple switch, right?
Yes.
Back to the visionary principle, right? Of
Yeah.
designing for what you're looking for and bringing forward the best in yourself and others. Adam, it's been a delight. The hour just
Thank you
flew
so much.
by. Thank you
Yes, it's
for
it's
joining us. Thank
midnight
you for
here, but I'm
staying
ready
up
to go.
late. Enjoy the time in Singapore, and we hope that you'll come back and be with us again.
I
Oh,
would love
maybe
to.
with when you write the next book.
That's right.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Okay.
everyone, for joining us. Goodbye.